a visitor from across the veil. There are questions the Inquisition does not ask, not because they lack curiosity, but because some inquiries crack open doors that were sealed for good reason. Consider for a moment a figure stepping out of the void, arriving through no warp rift and no webway gate, through some other mechanism entirely, from some other cosmology that shares the shape of a galaxy but not its substance. A black-armored giant, half man and half machine, breathing in the rhythmic cadence of a life support system never designed by any Forge world. His lenses are dark. He carries a weapon that produces a blade of coherent energy, and he moves with the unhurried confidence of a man who has not felt fear in a very long time. The name written in no Imperial record is Darth Vader, Dark Lord of the Sith, and in his home reality he is one of the most powerful beings alive. The question that follows is not a simple one. It is not merely whether he could survive a bolt round or whether a space marine could beat him in single combat. Those are the wrong measurements entirely. The real question asks what Vader actually is when you strip away the Star Wars context and translate him into the language the 41st Millennium understands. What does the warp see when it looks at him? What do the Chaos Gods think of a mortal who has spent decades marinating in hatred, grief, and obsessive devotion to a dark master? Can a man forged in one cosmology endure inside a completely different one? And if not, what would it take to make him something that could? The answers are uncomfortable. They suggest Vader would be genuinely dangerous by the standards of the average Imperial citizen, probably lethal to most threats a guardsman faces on any given Tuesday. But they also reveal fundamental ceilings that his nature imposes on him in this reality, ceilings that no amount of raw ferocity overcomes. There is a reason the 41st Millennium grinds everything down eventually. There is a reason even the mightiest champions of chaos end up bloated parodies of themselves, puppets wearing their own crowns. Vader would face the same pressures. Whether he has the architecture to resist them is the question worth asking. The Force and the Warp are not the same thing. Most crossover discussions slot Vader into the Psyker category the moment they observe that he moves objects with his mind and kills people without touching them. The instinct is understandable. It is also incomplete in ways that change the threat assessment entirely. In Star Wars, the Force is a living energy field generated by all life and divided by practitioners into a light side and a dark side. It binds the galaxy together. Midi-chlorians act as biological conductors for it. The Force crucially is not a dimension. It is not a place you can travel to or a space where gods live. It does not corrode the minds of its users through prolonged contact. It does not hunger. In the Star Wars cosmology, it functions closer to a cosmic nervous system than to a sea of emotion made manifest. The warp is nothing like that. The warp is a parallel dimension running alongside real space, fueled by and composed of psychic energy radiated by sentient life. Every feeling a human being experiences, from the smallest moment of irritation to the absolute depths of despair, ripples outward into the warp. Over millions of years of sentient life, those ripples cohered into gods, not symbolic archetypes given names to make fear manageable, but actual entities of almost incomprehensible power who exist in the warp, who feed on specific emotional frequencies, and who constantly push against the membrane between dimensions, seeking to expand their domains into real space. When a Psyker in the 41st Millennium uses their power, they are reaching into that dimension. They are opening a channel between themselves and something that wants things from them. The hazards are not theoretical. Psykers who lose control of their abilities do not merely fail to move objects. They crack open and demons pour through them. They spontaneously combust. They age decades in seconds. They draw entities across the veil simply by existing in an agitated emotional state. Vader's Force connection is a different mechanism. It is not warp-based in origin, but it would not be invisible to the warp. A being of Vader's emotional intensity, with his level of psychokinetic output and his decades-deep immersion in the dark side of a living energy field, would register in the warp the same way a burning building registers on a thermal scan. The warp does not distinguish between Force users and Psykers at the level of source. It responds to output, and Vader's output, translated into warp terms, would be significant. The Imperium Scholastica Psycana classifies Psyker strength using the Greek alphabet, running from Alpha at the top down to Omega at the bottom. An Omega-class Psyker can do little more than light candles with their mind and occasionally sense danger before it arrives. A Beta or Gamma-class Psyker represents a genuine military hazard. An Alpha-class Psyker can level buildings, flay mines across distances, and summon uncontrolled psychic storms. Alpha-level Psykers are among the rarest individuals the Imperium ever produces, and they are treated accordingly. Upon discovery, they are typically killed outright, soul-bound to the Emperor and burned out in his service, or conscripted into roles where their power can be directed under strict oversight, because no institution trusts them to operate freely without an extremely short leash. Vader would fall somewhere in the Alpha Plus range, the designation the Inquisition applies to Psykers whose capabilities outpace even the standard Alpha classification. His telekinetic capacity is enormous by any standard that matters in the 41st Millennium. He has demonstrated the ability to hurl objects with enough force to destroy machines, to reach into a person's nervous system and crush it with a gesture, and to intercept blaster bolts mid-flight and redirect them. These are not parlor tricks. Translated into Psyker terms, this places him among the most naturally powerful human-derived psychic beings the Imperium has ever encountered, well above the threshold where the Ordo Hereticus stops filing reports and starts organizing purges. One capacity is notably absent from his arsenal. Force lightning, which Palpatine and other Sith wielded freely, is not available to Vader. His right hand was replaced with a cybernetic prosthetic after Geonosis, years before Mustafar, and after Mustafar, the reconstruction replaced what remained of his limbs entirely. That architecture, possibly shaped by Palpatine to constrain as much as preserve, is incompatible with Force lightning. The suit's electrical systems cannot handle the discharge. He knows this. In the 41st Millennium, the absence matters because raw electrical discharge is one of the more effective tools a Psyker has against heavily armored targets. Vader's offensive repertoire, while broad, has a specific ceiling his master never shared. What the dark side looks like from the other side. The dark side of the Force runs on negative emotion, on rage and grief and sustained suffering used as accelerant, a way to burn hotter and hit harder in the short term at the cost of long-term spiritual corrosion. The Sith have understood this since Bane restructured the Order around the Rule of Two. Vader was trained to use his anguish as a weapon, to reach into the furnace of everything he had lost and pull power out of the wreckage. From the Warp's perspective, this is an open invitation. Consider what Vader actually radiates on an emotional level. He carries within him the knowledge that Padme died on a medical table far from him. In the hours after he tried to kill her, her last words a declaration that there was still good in him. He lives with the memory of slaughtering children in the Jedi Temple. He breathes through a machine because he burned on the shores of Mustafar until Palpatine came to collect what remained of him. Every moment of his existence is saturated with grief, transformed into hatred, transformed into purpose. He is, in the Warp's language, a sustained transmission on every frequency the ruinous powers find nourishing. The four Chaos Gods would each read something different in him, and none of their conclusions would be neutral. Khorne sees the body count first. Vader has killed more people than most warlords, through direct action, through fleet commands, through entire planets obliterated as demonstrations of Imperial authority, and the Blood God respects this on a fundamental level. But Khorne is not simple. He despises sorcery and Psykers equally, holding in contempt any warrior who wins through invisible manipulation rather than direct violence. A man who chokes admirals with a thought rather than tearing out their throat with his hands occupies an uneasy position in Khorne's cosmology. He earns Khorne's grudging acknowledgement as a killer, but Khorne's demons would view him with contempt rather than kinship. The bloodletters would come for him not to recruit him, but to destroy something that offends their patron. Tzeentch is more interested. The Changer of Ways has spent the entire history of the galaxy weaving plots across timelines, and Vader's existence is exactly the kind of narrative Tzeentch savors. A man prophesied to bring balance to the Force who fell, served faithfully and then destroyed his master anyway through an act of love rather than power. The Lord of Change would recognize the shape of this story and find it delicious. More to the point, Vader's Force connection gives him a sensitivity to precognition and spatial awareness that, translated into warp terms, looks very similar to the gifts Tzeentch grants his own champions. Tzeentch would see in Vader a potential instrument rather than an enemy, someone to redirect rather than crush, a story not yet finished in a way that would benefit from a new author. Nurgle would find Vader the most personally interesting of all. The Plague Father is not merely the god of disease, he is the god of entropy, of inevitability, of the kind of love that corrupts through smothering. Vader's body is already a temple to decay. He breathes recycled air through damaged lungs. His limbs are metal and polymer. His skin, wherever it remains, is scar tissue over scar tissue. He requires constant chemical supplementation simply to maintain basic biological function. He exists in perpetual pain. Nurgle would look at this man and see not an enemy but a distant cousin, someone who has been quietly receiving his gifts for years without knowing it. The despair underneath the hatred, the grief that was never processed because it was transmuted into purpose rather than faced, the physical ruin held together by machinery rather than healing. These are Nurgle's domains. The temptation Nurgle would offer would not be disease. It would be an end to the pain, a release from the machine, rest in the only form Vader has never been permitted to have. Papa Nurgle's embrace has claimed more proud warriors than 1,000 blades, because it does not attack from outside. It whispers from inside the wound that never healed. Slaanesh presents a different problem. The Prince of Pleasure feeds on excess, sensation, and obsessive desire, and Vader at first glance seems profoundly resistant to these temptations. The suit denies him most physical sensation. He has systematically suppressed his emotional life, or tried to. He has no interest in luxury, hedonism, or the accumulation of sensory experience. But Slaanesh does not only work through pleasure, it works through obsession, through the attachment that a person cannot let go of no matter what it costs them. Vader's obsession with the woman who died believing in him, with the child he can sense somewhere out in the Force but cannot find, with the version of himself that was burned away on Mustafar. This is exactly the kind of wound Slaanesh probes. The approach is not through pleasure at all. It is through grief, through the version of Vader who is still, underneath everything, Anakin Skywalker screaming inside a suit of black armor. This is the critical strategic vulnerability, and it is not the life support system, though that matters. It is the emotional core that Vader has never fully sealed because he cannot. The dark side keeps the wound open because the wound is the fuel source, which means the Chaos Gods have permanent access to something Vader cannot afford to close without losing the power base that keeps him alive. The combat reality. The metaphysics matter enormously in this analysis, but they do not eliminate the physical question, and the physical question deserves a serious answer. In direct combat against a single opponent, Vader is extraordinarily dangerous. His lightsaber mastery sits at the highest tier his tradition produces. Form 5, specifically the Gem. So Variant is designed around power and aggression, around turning an opponent's attacks back on them and dominating through force of impact rather than finesse. He trained for decades. He fought in the Clone Wars when the galaxy's finest warriors were active in the field. He has killed Jedi Masters in single combat. The swordsmanship, translated into the 41st Millennium, would compare favorably to the finest blade traditions the Imperium produces. The Adeptus Custodes Blade Masters, the Sanguinary Guard. His telekinetics function as a force multiplier in ways most conventional warriors have no framework to anticipate. He does not need to physically reach you. He can crush armor from across the room, deflect incoming fire, and tear a weapon from your hands before you fire it. He can sense attacks before they land through precognitive awareness and adjust his defenses accordingly. Against an unaugmented human adversary, or even a lightly augmented one, Vader is an extinction event. Against a Space Marine in full power armor, things become more complicated. A bolter round that connects with his life support systems is a potentially mission-ending problem, not because it kills him outright, but because that suit is not a weapon platform. It is a medical device. Sever the right connections, compromise the right atmospheric seals, and Vader does not die from the wound. He dies from what the wound prevents. A Space Marine veteran with a power fist and the tactical sense to aim for the chest plate rather than the head would have a genuine chance of winning that fight through indirect means, even if they could not match his psychokinetic output. Against a Grey Knight, the combat calculus shifts more dramatically. The Grey Knights are the Imperium's demon hunting chapter, every battle brother a Psyker in his own right, trained specifically to fight warp-touched entities and individuals who use psychic powers offensively. Their weapons are sanctified against demonic presences. Their armor incorporates psychic wards. Their combat doctrine is built around disrupting psychic channels and weathering the kind of telekinetic pressure Vader applies. He would be read as a hostile Psyker of exceptional power, and Grey Knights suppress those. The fight would be genuinely competitive, but the Grey Knights would not be overmatched. The opponent Vader is least equipped to handle is not a greater demon. It is a Culexus Assassin. The Culexus Temple produces individuals born with the pariah gene, a null psychic trait that renders them entirely invisible to the warp and generates a zone of crushing psychic deadness around them. The Animus Speculum, a helmet device fitted to each assassin, collects the warp energy being involuntarily torn from Psykers within that radius and discharges it back as a directed weapon. Within the Culexus's operational radius, Psykers experience nausea, disorientation, and the progressive collapse of their psychic abilities. The closer the range, the worse the effect. For a man whose entire combat doctrine, whose entire identity, depends on constant access to the Force, this is not a difficult opponent. It is a catastrophic one. Vader's precognition goes dark. His telekinetics falter. His ability to intercept incoming fire vanishes. What remains is a heavily armored man with a bad suit and a sword, operating on reaction time alone against an assassin specifically built to kill people like him. Against a demon of significant power, Vader's survivability depends entirely on whether his Force abilities can harm immaterial entities. Within his own cosmology, Force-based attacks affect both physical and non-physical targets. In the 41st Millennium, damaging a demon requires either weapons sanctified against them, psychic attacks, or faith-powered abilities. If Vader's Force powers are treated as a form of psychic attack, and there is a reasonable argument that they should be given their functional similarities to warp energy manipulation, he can hurt demons. If they are treated as purely physical telekinesis, he cannot. This ambiguity is not a small one. It is potentially the difference between surviving a demon encounter and being torn apart by something he cannot touch. Against a greater demon, a bloodthirster, or a Lord of Change, or a great unclean one, the fight is almost certainly unwinnable for Vader as he stands. These are not large monsters. They are concentrated fragments of divine will given physical form, and they have been fighting Psyker since before humanity discovered fire. A bloodthirster is an entity capable of tearing through entire Space Marine strike forces without slowing. It does not find a powerful but mortal Psyker in a medical device particularly threatening. Whatever skill Vader brings, whatever power he carries, it does not bridge that gap. The corruption question. Surviving combat is the smaller of Vader's two problems in the 41st Millennium. The larger one is whether he can survive the warp's sustained attention without being slowly hollowed out and refilled with something else, and he would be in constant danger of this without ever clearly understanding what was happening until it was well advanced. The dark side of the Force and the Chaos Gods share the same fuel source, negative emotion. The mechanism is different, the cosmological plumbing does not connect, but the emotional raw material is identical. Vader has spent decades training himself to draw power from the precise emotional states that the Chaos Gods use as vectors of infection. He has essentially spent his entire Sith career conditioning himself to open his emotional defenses to something that, in the 40K universe, would exploit that opening immediately. Champions of Chaos in the 41st Millennium do not typically begin their service knowing they are being corrupted. It starts as advantage, as power arriving whenever they reach into dark emotion, as victories that should not have been possible. The corruption is in the reward itself, in the slow accumulation of marks and gifts and mutations that arrive without being asked for. By the time a champion understands what they have been accumulating, they are already too far in to turn back and too invested to want to. Vader's iron will is real. He suppresses emotion as a tactical discipline even while drawing on it. He has refused Palpatine the satisfaction of complete submission at key moments in their relationship. His eventual redemption in his own cosmology was powered by the same buried core of humanity that the Chaos Gods would most want to exploit, which means that core is both his best defense and his most exposed target. Tzeentch would be the most persistent threat on the corruption axis. The mechanism Tzeentch uses most reliably is not temptation. It is information, the slow revelation of hidden truths designed to radicalize, to create obsessive purpose, to redirect a person's existing drives towards Tzeentch's preferred outcomes. Vader already has obsessive drives. In a reality where he has no contact with the child he can sense but cannot locate, where he is isolated and surrounded by a hostile cosmology he does not understand, Tzeentch's agents could offer him exactly what he actually wants: a name, a location, confirmation that someone survived. The price would be paid incrementally in small services until the debt became the relationship. The version of Vader who resists corruption is the version who has already accepted his own death and let go of what he lost. That version existed for approximately the last 15 minutes of his life in his own cosmology. Prior to that point, for most of his adult existence, Vader carried exactly the profile the ruinous powers prefer in a champion: powerful, isolated, motivated by grief, and absolutely certain of his own righteousness. None of those qualities make someone chaos resistant. They are precisely the qualities that chaos recruiters spend centuries looking for. The Geller Field Problem. There is a practical threat the combat analysis does not cover, and it is specific to the mechanics of travel in the 41st Millennium. Any ship transiting through the warp is protected by a Geller Field, a bubble of real space projected around the hull that holds the immaterium at bay and prevents the entities inside it from tearing through and slaughtering the crew. Geller fields can fail for many reasons: mechanical fault, navigator error, warp turbulence, or demonic assault from entities drawn to the vessel by something aboard. A sufficiently powerful and emotionally volatile Psyker is exactly the kind of beacon that draws those entities to begin the assault in the first place. Vader radiates like a distress flare even at rest. An emotionally activated Vader, fighting or enraged or grieving, would be broadcasting on every frequency the entities inside the warp hunt by. Any captain or navigator who understood what Vader was would face a genuine dilemma. This passenger increases the probability of Geller field failure more than almost any external threat the warp could produce on its own. It means Vader cannot simply go where he wishes in the 41st Millennium without raising the odds of a catastrophic breach for every person on the vessel around him, and without drawing exactly the kind of attention a newly arrived Psyker of his power level cannot afford. There is no solution to this. It is a consequence of what he is, operating in a cosmology that treats what he is as a target. The Mechanicus variable. There is one faction in the Imperium that would respond to Vader's arrival in a way that is genuinely unpredictable, and that faction is the Adeptus Mechanicus. The Mechanicus would be fascinated to the point of compromised judgment. They would see a being already extensively cybernetically modified, using an energy weapon powered by a kyber crystal corrupted through means no Mechanicus databank contains, who seems to interface with an invisible energy field that affects the physical world in ways no known science can fully explain, and who keeps himself alive through a suite of life support machinery that, while primitive by Forge World standards, represents an independent technological tradition with potentially recoverable insights. The Omnissiah does not have a category for this. That absence of category is itself a form of worship to the Mechanicus. They would want to know everything. The machine god's servants catalog, preserve, and augment. A powerful Psyker already partially integrated with cybernetics, already dependent on machines for survival, already accustomed to treating the biological components of himself as secondary to his function, is the closest thing to an ideal candidate the Mechanicus could imagine for extreme augmentation. The ethical concerns that might restrain the Inquisition do not apply to the Mechanicus in the same way. The data slate proposals would begin before Vader had time to object. What full Mechanicus augmentation would actually do to Vader's Force connection is genuinely unclear, and that uncertainty is interesting rather than dismissive. In the 40K universe, cybernetics do not by default suppress psychic ability. Psykers with augmetics exist across multiple factions. What the Mechanicus could offer is not a reduction of his current abilities, but an amplification of his physical infrastructure. Better atmospheric support, neural interfaces that bypass the damaged tissue in his throat and eliminate the reliance on the vocabulator. Proper atmospheric sealing that removes the vulnerability of the life support system to physical damage, enhanced sensory packages, structural reinforcements that give him the physical resilience the suit currently lacks. The result would be something meaningfully more dangerous than the Vader who stepped out of the void. Not because the Force grew stronger, but because the container got better. A Psyker of Alpha Plus strength with optimized cybernetics, proper armor, and Mechanicus standard life support is not the same threat as the same Psyker in a medical device. The baseline capabilities stay the same. The survivability, the endurance, the ability to sustain combat without a single bolt round to the wrong pipe ending everything. These improve substantially. Whether Vader would accept this intervention is a different question. He's not a man who trusts institutions easily, and the Mechanicus has its own agenda. But in the 41st Millennium, operating alone is not a long-term survival strategy. The galaxy has too many things in it that hunt lone wolves specifically. The Dreadnought Hypothesis. There is a second upgrade path worth considering, and it is the one that produces the most dramatic shift in Vader's threat ceiling. Not because it is the most likely, but because it forces the analysis to its logical extreme. The Dreadnought chassis was developed by the Adeptus Astartes to preserve the most valuable Space Marine warriors who suffered wounds so severe that death was otherwise inevitable. A warrior interred in a Dreadnought is not piloting a vehicle. They are connected to it. The sarcophagus at the center contains the warrior's biological remains, interfaced directly with the machine, and the machine responds to their will and nervous system as an extension of their own body. They experience the world through the Dreadnought's sensors. They strike with its fists. The biological self has become the command center for a walking war machine that weighs several tons and carries weapons capable of leveling structures. Vader is already living a version of this arrangement. His black armor is not an exoskeleton. It is a life support system he cannot remove, a mechanical body he cannot leave. The conceptual distance between Vader in his suit and a Space Marine interred in a Dreadnought is smaller than it first appears, which is precisely what makes the hypothetical interesting rather than absurd. A Dreadnought chassis housing Vader would not suppress his Force powers. There is no reason to believe it would. Psykers augmented with technology retain their psychic ability because the power is neurological and metaphysical in origin rather than biological in the way that would be disrupted by replacing biological mass with metal. What the Dreadnought chassis provides is a completely different scale of physical presence and durability. The life support vulnerability disappears. The suit that can be killed by precision gunfire is replaced by armor designed to walk into anti-tank fire and keep moving. The weapon systems are battlefield grade rather than personal. Consider what Vader's Force powers do inside that chassis. He already uses telekinesis to hurl objects and deflect energy. Inside a Dreadnought, every physical action he takes is already the action of a war machine. His Force-driven enhancement of a punch becomes the Force-driven enhancement of a Dreadnought fist. His ability to sense and deflect incoming fire becomes an early warning system layered on top of machine spirit targeting. His capacity to affect objects at range becomes a second weapon system operating independently of his chassis armament. The version of Vader who can kill a Space Marine in a stand-up fight becomes, inside a Dreadnought, something that can threaten a small armored column through a combination of physical force and psychic disruption. He would not be Primarch tier. The gap between a powerful Psyker in a Dreadnought chassis and an actual Primarch remains enormous. But he would cross the threshold from notable individual threat to legitimate strategic problem. The Inquisition would stop issuing threat assessments and start considering orbital solutions. Whether this version of Vader is still Vader is a philosophical question worth sitting with. Dreadnoughts are known for the psychological toll they exact. Extended internment produces instability in most chapter traditions. The isolation, the diminished sensory input, the disconnect from a physical human experience. These corrode the mind over time in ways that have nothing to do with chaos. Vader already has a psyche that has been under extraordinary pressure for decades. The Dreadnought might stabilize him physically while accelerating the internal erosion that the Chaos Gods have been patiently working toward. Could he survive a reckoning? Darth Vader, arriving in the 41st Millennium as he is, would survive initially. His combat capabilities place him above virtually every unaugmented human and most lightly augmented ones. His Force precognition would warn him of most immediate physical threats before they materialized. His telekinetics would give him options that other individuals of comparable size and strength do not have. By the standards of the Imperium's average battlefield, he would be extremely dangerous and difficult to kill through conventional means. The factors working against him are systemic rather than personal. The warp's active hostility toward a being of his emotional signature is not something he can fight directly. Every use of his force abilities in the 41st Millennium carries the risk of drawing warp entities through the connection he is creating, not because he is weak, but because the warp in this universe is alive and hungry in a way that the Force is not. He would need to learn quickly the discipline that Psykers in this universe spend their entire lives trying to master: how to use power without opening a door you cannot close. That discipline was never part of his training. The Sith approach runs directly counter to it. His emotional vulnerability to chaos corruption is genuine and unaddressed by anything his training prepared him for. The skills that make him effective, the ability to reach into negative emotion and pull power out of it, are the exact mechanism through which the ruinous powers poison their champions. He would need to recognize this threat and adapt to it without losing the power base that makes him worth keeping alive. That is not an impossible task, but it is one that has killed better men than him. The life support suit is a continuous liability. The Geller field problem makes him a hazard to any vessel he travels on. The same emotional volatility that fuels his power is the frequency on which the warp hunts. What Vader ultimately is, stripped of the mythology that makes him feel like a cosmic force of nature in his home reality, is a profoundly powerful and profoundly isolated individual operating in a reality specifically designed to grind down individuals. The 41st Millennium does not produce heroes who stand alone and endure. It produces institutions, chapters, legions, orders, cults, all of which understand that the warp cannot be defeated by one person regardless of how strong that person is. Vader's entire existence has been defined by the dyad of master and apprentice. Two Sith alone against the galaxy. In this galaxy, that formula is not a path to dominance. It is a path to being identified, targeted, and eventually destroyed by something that does not care how many admirals you have choked. He would be formidable enough that most mortals could not touch him, and he would earn the respect of those who understood what they were looking at. But he would not be a god in the 41st Millennium. He would be a very dangerous mortal in a universe that has spent 10,000 years getting better at killing very dangerous mortals, and the warp would have strong opinions about his future long before he had time to form his own. What the Inquisition files would say. There is an apocryphal tradition in certain Ordo Xenos cells of maintaining what are called hypothetical threat assessments, documents that classify entities from unverified or theoretical sources according to standard inquisitorial threat metrics. These documents are not official, they are exercises, but they reveal how the Inquisition thinks about power. Under this tradition, Vader's file would open with a threat classification in the highest tiers the Inquisition applies to individuals rather than armies, the range reserved for entities whose unchecked existence poses danger to significant populations. His Psyker rating would be marked as Alpha+, with an addendum noting that his psychic mechanism is anomalous and not fully understood. His vulnerability profile would note the life support dependency in bold and the Geller field incompatibility in red. His chaos corruption risk would be rated as high, with specific flags for Tzeentchian and Nerglite vectors. The recommended response would not be immediate neutralization. The Inquisition, at its most pragmatic, does not destroy assets it can control, it recruits them. Vader, for all his danger, is exactly the kind of individual an ambitious Inquisitor Lord would look at and see possibility. A powerful independent Psyker with extraordinary combat capability and no institutional loyalties, who could be offered the thing he actually wants in exchange for service. That kind of leverage has moved mountains in the 41st Millennium. Whether it would move Darth Vader is a question the file would leave open, annotated in the margin with a single notation. He already served one Dark Master. Determine whether he has the capacity to serve another, or whether the second attempt will be the thing that finally breaks him open. The answer to that question is the only one that truly matters, and in the 41st Millennium, everything that breaks open eventually feeds something else.